Welcome back to another interview episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. Today we have a true veteran of the industry, a pioneer of gaming distribution in the early days of 8-bit microcomputers, who would go on to be the American distribution arm of Psygnosis, have dealings with every major player in the industry over the decades, and he was there to help shepherd along the phenomenon that was Rock Band. Welcome to the show, Jerry Wolosenko.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's start right from the beginning. How did you get into this field?
So my background is actually I kind of came at this from if you use a baseball metaphor, from left field. My education, the background was in government and government finance, and I used to work for the mayor of New York City.
Wow.
So, but I went to science and engineering high school in New York City, a school called Stuyvesant High School, and then after that, I kind of so I always had an avocational interest in electronics. It always was of interest to me, but I went off in a different area when I did my higher education. So I finished undergraduate school, did some graduate school, and then served in the U.S. Army overseas in the late '60s. When I came back from my overseas service, I came back to what I was educated in, which was government, and I ended up working for the New York City administration, and specifically in the mayor's office in this analytical group, for about 7 years. And however, during that whole time, I always had, like I say, avocational interest in electronics. And I was watching the evolution of, there were these kind of things that were going on with computers, and I found that to be of interest. And there were a couple of intermediary steps, but I ended up moving up to Boston, leaving the job after about 7 years. I said, this other place is a lot more interesting to me, and I'm going to take a chance. And I went up to Boston. My brother, who was up here, was involved in the media business. He was a commercial photographer and filmmaker, and I came up and we did that kind of work for a couple of years, but I was, I saw the potential of these, and the Apple had just come out, the Trash 80s were coming out, and so on. So I sort of saw, there was a communication media type potential in computers. So I started to educate myself about it. My brother and I, he also had an interest in it. We shut down our advertising media business. We sold off pieces of it for not a lot of money. And he went off to California, and I was sort of still looking around at the video, at the computer stuff, but I also was very interested in the media side in video discs. I thought that, and this was just when video discs was starting, I thought that was going to be a phenomenal breakthrough if you could address specific pieces on some, randomly, or, in some, not in serial order, but actually go out on these discs and try to find this equipment, put it together. And so information, put it together. Anyway, long story short, my brother went out to the West Coast. He also was interested, and we both got interested. He got interested first in the Atari computer, and got back in touch with me, and obviously we were talking all the time. He said, you got to check out these Ataris, Atari 400, 800, the VCS machine, and this video game stuff is really pretty cool. So I went out to the West Coast for a couple of weeks, stayed with him, and I don't know how many hundreds of dollars I spent in an arcade playing. I'm trying to remember. Defender. Defender was. One of the really, really cool games. So anyway, I got hooked on video games. The Atari computer was, and this is kind of interesting and important, because the Atari computer was a development platform, essentially. People could get, and people on the West Coast could get their hands on the computer and they could begin programming it. unlike the VCS, unlike the console, which you couldn't. It was a closed system, and the only guys that broke the code were the guys from iMagic. They were the first ones to do that. And then the oh god, I'm trying to remember the second one. Levy.
Activision. Yeah.
Activision. But the computer essentially was an open development system. And it's similar. You'll see that same pattern with the Commodore 64. And the Commodore 64 played a very, very crucial role in kind of the explosive evolution of video game development in Europe because it was an open development system. So what ended up happening is that there were some games being developed on the Apple, but Apple didn't pay much attention to that. Apple was focused on, serious uses. And for Apple, VisiCalc was the killer application. But the Atari 400 and then the 800 were really very cool development platforms and programmable computers. So people started developing games for those, and those are the kinds of games that small dealers and I could distribute, because the games that were being distributed by Atari on the console, those all went to large retailers, that had a very highly evolved distribution system that essentially came from the consumer electronics sales reps, which is the way those things are sold, were recruited by Atari, and they are the ones that got involved in that ecosystem and getting the cartridges out to large retailers. We had carved out a completely different part of that market. And, because it didn't require, in order to buy or in order to be a distributor for Atari, you had to have hundreds of thousands of dollars and, buy millions of dollars worth of inventory, which obviously I wasn't in any position to do, nor were any of the other people who were involved in it. But what ended up happening is that there were very innovative games that were being developed. One of the companies that developed these innovative games was a company my brother started. It was a company called Synapse Software.
Oh, really?
Okay. Yeah. So Synapse Software specialized in Atari-based computer games. And then they did some Apple games as well, but they did some really, really cool, innovative games that sold extremely well. So that was of great advantage to me because I was an exclusive distributor for Synapse games and everybody wanted Synapse games. So that helped me enormously to build my business.
Now, just to interrupt, for our listeners, describe to us at this point in time, I'm guessing we're talking 1980, 81. What is a distributor? What does a software distributor in 1980, 1981 look like?
Okay, I had about half a dozen people working for me. We had a small warehouse. We had a cobbled together inventory control invoicing system that would crash every week, and I'd spend the whole night trying to fix it. And and it was a big deal. And we did actually the inventory system we did on PCs, IBM PCs, which were just starting. And it was a big deal to have a 5. I'm trying to remember. 5
1/4 inch.
Yeah, well, everything was distributed in 5. But the original distribution essentially was on cassettes. On cassettes, and then the 5 1/4 inch discs came in, and those were a real breakthrough. You could put a lot more information on. Cassettes didn't last very long. They were, a real pain, and they went away very, very quickly. 5 1/4 inch discs lasted a long time, and they lasted until the early 90s when DVDs, when CDs actually first came out, and CDs were the next big iteration in media. Yeah. But what a distributor did was, I bought 100 pieces of a game, or 200 pieces, or 400 pieces of a game, depending on what it looked like, from developers like Sierra Online, Electronic Arts, First Star Software. There's a whole bunch of companies, small developers, all in the United States, or mostly in the United States. They'd ship it to me. I'd send out circulars, and I had 2 sales guys that would be on the phone talking to dealers saying, hey, we got this new stuff. Are you interested? And they say, sure, send us 5, send us 6, send us 2 to show, 2 to go. So what we would do is break up these multiple hundred shipments and put them into smaller boxes. And, I'd buy them at 60 off or 50 off, and I'd sell them to retailers for 40 off. So that's my margin. It wasn't a heavy-duty margin, and it was actually a tough business. But we did very well. Our business did very well because we really focused. I and a couple of people really focused in on the games that were being developed and tried to maintain relationships with new developers. So dealers came to us because we always had the newest stuff, and there was new stuff coming out all the time. I used to go to the West Coast Computer Faire and so on. And that's the relationship that I had. The distribution business is traditionally, not just in software, but traditionally based on customer service. You make sure that you provide the products to your customers who are the retailers. You provide them with a service. That service is you ferret out equipment, or you really know the equipment, or you ferret out new products, the equipment. It's very difficult to maintain, and it's about service. You'll turn it around. You get the product to them in a day, in 2 days. They'll get invoiced every month and that sort of thing. But it's in the software business, in the gaming business at that time, it was really, our advantage was that we were very adroit at identifying new good products, games that people would be interested in. And we started this. The name of my company was Apex Resources, and we had a thing called the Apex Advantage, where basically we wouldn't have to. They trusted us. The dealers trusted us, and when we got a new product in, we would sell them some predetermined amount. Like 6. Half a dozen discs and 3 cassettes, So like as soon as something new came in, we didn't even have to call the dealers. They trusted us. We sent it out to them, and and that was one of the ways that we were innovative. But that was the role of the distributor. The distributor was somebody who bought at a higher discount, provided service in breaking it down and addressing a very scattered market, so that the developers who really didn't have any kind of business infrastructure, the developers didn't have to, they didn't have to deal with that. One of our other big customers right here in the Boston, if you know this area, Infocom was a big,
Oh,
yeah. So if
quick question. Now, you're talking about buying the product and selling it to the retailers. So I know from other people that the toy business at this point is a consignment business, and that's where most of the cartridge console software is going. Is your business a consignment business at this point, or are you straight sales?
No, we were selling. I couldn't afford to be a consignment business. On rare occasions, if there was a really bad product that went out there, we would, in order to maintain the relationship and the trust with the retailers, we would do that. But it was, at that point, it was not a consignment business. Later on, it evolved into a consignment business once the numbers became very large and we started to deal with much larger companies. So I ran my business for about 5 years, and then I sold it in around 1985, 86 to a larger distributor in the Chicago area. CCS. I'm trying to remember. Computer something. CCS was a company, and they were a subsidiary of a large periodicals distributor. A distributor who sold the magazines, newspapers to kiosks and so on. So they had a very large physical distribution system. So those guys, it was a funny story because those guys ended up buying my company because they just got so pissed off at the fact that we always beat them. They would call dealers and say, "Hey, we got this new product," and the dealers would say, "We got it already. We got it through Apex." And so, I had a small company. Probably at that point, I had 15 people working for me. Some people in the warehouse, salespeople, a couple of administrative people, and but it was a really, really tough business. And in order to continue to compete where the margins were getting squeezed, I would have had to capitalize at a very high level, and I didn't want to do that. It was too risky. But one of the things that put us ahead of our competitors also was that I was one of the first guys that went to Europe. So in like 1984, maybe, I went to England it was a computer show every year in September. So I went to England and I made some contacts there. And that's when, I don't remember when the Commodore 64 first came out, right around that time.
82, I think it premieres in 82, doesn't really hit the market until 83.
Right. And so the products that I could bring over were basically Commodore 64, because then we started to sell Commodore 64 also. And they were making Atari products in Europe as well. So when I went to England, I made a bunch of contacts, and I said, "Hey, I'm selling this stuff in the U.S. If you guys want to try to address that market, let's put something together." And it was the same sort of thing. They had no idea of how to get into the U.S. market, and for me, it was a way to present product to the U.S. market that they weren't seeing at all. The retailers, they were reading about it. They were reading about in some of the publications, but they weren't getting that product. So it was an interesting time, and it was one of the companies that I made contact with and then had a very, very tight relationship with Psygnosis. I don't know if you recall that company, but Psygnosis was also doing games for Mac systems. So I was able to install some of those games. And Psygnosis,
when you were importing product from Europe, were you importing finished boxed product, or were you just licensing it for production in the U.S.?
No, actually, it was boxed product. It was boxed product, and then we kind of transitioned into doing the packaging in the U.S. because it was not a particularly efficient way of getting product here. Where we'd have it in the boxes. If we could print those boxes here and then insert the discs, but we still were getting discs, but we were doing the packaging here.
Okay, gotcha. And the first product that you imported for Psygnosis or under the Psygnosis brand was Bradicus, correct?
That's what I recall. I'm pretty sure it was Bradicus.
Okay. And was there any particular reason why you chose that title to be the first one, or
it was the first product they were doing? It looked kind of cool. And they were also, I'm trying to remember now, I think it may have been available for the Atari ST, which was, the machine that was really kind of on the level of the Amiga, because that was the big competition there, Atari and Commodore, after Trammell left Commodore and he started Atari. And I think that was one of the reasons. The other format, of course, was Commodore 64 format, which preceded Amiga. But I can't recall, to tell you the truth, I don't think Bradicus was available on the Amiga, on the Commodore 64.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Um,
Really, I had a very tight relationship with them. And then once I sold my business, I became, actually not right away, but a couple of years later, I became the head of their North American distribution. And their business really expanded in North America. And it's going to sound immodest, but it was because I was doing their business. I knew the territory, I knew the business in the U.S., the shows, the people that they needed to see, and so on. And they grew into a real powerhouse, and were acquired in the early '90s by Sony, because we were the main focus of the Sony PlayStation development community in England. I mean, this is like hours and hours of additional conversation. So, but that's kind of a quick overview. And once I started working with Psygnosis, I worked with those guys for a few years until I got bought by Sony. I didn't want to join a large organization like Sony. And then I started working with startups here in the Boston area, and I worked with a few startups, helped them grow. And then, interestingly enough, in the early '90s, I set up a North American distribution for Ravensburger. Ravensburger had a software division that they started also. So anyway, but that's another story. That's generally what the distribution thing looked like.
Gotcha. So
it was about ferreting out products, whether I found those products in the United States or whether I went to Europe. And then I went to Germany, I went to France. I started to really look around and developed a whole bunch of contacts where I could bring those products into North America.
And that does beg the question. So what processes did you have in the distribution channel to sort of evaluate the quality of a product in order to know whether or not it's something you wanted to invest in inventory-wise?
It's a great question, and it's a well-structured question. It comes from a well-structured thinking about this. But you know what? It was seat of the pants. That's the way you evaluate games. You don't. I wish I could tell you there was a rigorous process where we did checklists and so on. It's got to do this, got to do that. It's like we'd get a product in, and I'd say, "Hey, Jim, take a look at that," or I'd look at it, or ask one of people whose judgment I trusted, or it came from a developer that had been recommended to me, and it was like, yeah, this doesn't suck. All right, let's do it. And that was it. And then what we did run into sometimes was inability of the developers to provide enough product. That was always when you're dealing with an immature market. One of the problems is you have a hit, and then all of a sudden everybody wants it, and the developer can't produce it. They can't provide enough product, which is very annoying because you spend time developing the market, and then if you can't feed stuff into that market, it's very frustrating. But that was it. I mean, and then with subsequent products that might come from the same developers, it was okay. Those guys had a good game. They deserve our attention. They were able to provide us product when we needed it. They're thinking about how they're going to build their business, and so that's the way these useful, productive relationships evolve. But it's so much of it was seat of the pants, and that was what was so cool about the industry. It's like pioneering, on all kinds of stuff, and you try it, you test it. Some of it fails, some of it succeeds, and it's only after you reach a certain level that it becomes, the system starts to take hold. But in video games, video games are very much like the movie business or the music business. And a lot of people in the video games, once it got to the mid 80s or so, came from the music business. Acclaim Software, a bunch of other people too, the salespeople and so on came from the music business, very similar model. It's hits driven. The only games that continue to succeed are franchise games. Call of Duty, Madden, all of the kinds of titles that But there is still always the possibility of a breakthrough, and that's what made the industry so interesting. Each time there is a technology leap, a new, the NVIDIA chip gets invented, right? And people start, and its first iteration is on video cards that you put in PCs. So all of a sudden, people making games for PCs are using the NVIDIA capabilities, and everybody's saying, "Holy shit! I'm blown away. Look at what can happen." Or the game is being delivered on a CD. I mean, that's how Psygnosis built their business. Games were developed on CDs. They had cutscenes and so on. So each time there is this kind of leap in technology, there's an opportunity for innovative game developers to use the improvements in that technology and break through. But it's still hits driven. It's got to have that magic that people are going to play that game and they're going to say, I got to play one more time. If I do it one more time, I know I can break through. I have that skill now, and that's what it takes. Mm-hmm. So, other than capitalizing on franchises, which is what people do, which is, so many software developers and so many software publishers have essentially done that. That's what happens. The other big problem during that time was piracy. Piracy was incredible. I mean, we knew what was going on in the rest of the world. Western Europe, not so bad, but the rest of the world, forget about it. And the only way that you could compete in other parts of the world was you would have to be doing it on a local economy. So it didn't make sense for the developers in the United States to create disks, packaging, and so on, and send it to another country because it was way, way too expensive. The only way you could succeed is if you did some sort of licensing thing and you had somebody in the local market whose economics were driven by the local market, not bringing in something that costs, $39.95 retail, buying it for $18 and trying to sell it in Buenos Aires, at a profit. It wasn't going to happen.
As from personal experience, I can verify that was not going to happen.
Yeah. So the thing that happened, and finally the real breakthrough was, and people tried to do all sorts of things, dongles, codes, all sorts of stuff, is only when the ecosystem really tuned into online games and improvements in those games and the player experience had to go back and get verified and enriched because you could do it online. That was the only real way of preventing piracy. Otherwise, it was a constant struggle. And there are numbers for business, for the business model. There are numbers that say, the revenue generated by the sale of video games from 1985 to 2005 was probably 50% of what it could have been.
Because if that.
Yeah. So that was a real issue for the whole business ecosystem, at that time.
Yeah. And so when you're doing the distribution in the early 80s, are you limiting yourself purely to entertainment software, or are there any attempts to also distribute application software?
There were opportunities to do application software, but the platforms that I was distributing to were not being used as application platforms. So an interesting thing is that Synapse Software, one of the products that they had was a file management program. Real simple simple lookups and so on, called File Manager 800. And File Manager was That was one of the advantages that I had because people were looking for application software on the Atari, and they kind of bought it. It was very popular for a while, but the Atari and the Commodore 64, there were programs, there were business programs on, but they ultimately failed. Those were not the platforms. The PC and the Apple became the dominant platforms for, kind of serious business applications. So there was kind of a brief flare up, but it wasn't of any importance economically or in any other way.
Gotcha. So now, 85, you sell the company.
Yeah.
What is your
86 actually?
86. Okay. And so, what is your next move after that?
Well, interestingly, towards the end of the business, I was also starting to do some publishing. So what I was looking for, and it was primarily developers from Europe. I had a guy I was working with who was identifying some development houses who had software that essentially we could produce in the United States and distribute. But they weren't reliable. We did 2 or 3 titles like that. They weren't reliable, and I just didn't. It was too dangerous, to manufacture the discs, manufacture the packaging, and so on, and then they wouldn't follow up. I remember working with one German company. I can't remember the name of the company, but they really pissed me off because we put a lot of effort. They had a decent product, and they just kind of never really followed through. They could have really built, I think, a more serious business.
Do you happen to remember the name of the product?
I can't. Actually, there were a couple of kind of standard products. One of the products was it had something set. The title had something like Joule, and it was like a mining program. It was a very, very popular category. Other people kind of ripped off the idea as well, but that was a big deal. That category of game, so they were. But my next step, so I was doing some publishing, and then I was bought, and I took a couple of months off, and then I had a friend there was a publication called Antic magazine at the time. Antic covered the Atari world, and I knew the publisher of that quite well. His name was Jim Caporell, and he asked me to come, and they were doing some software. They had software that was submitted by readers, and they thought that maybe they could sell that. So I went, and he was in San Francisco, and I worked with him for a couple of years, and we sort of developed that, but it didn't really explode as we had liked to. And then I came back to Boston, and that's when I went to work with Psygnosis and built up their business. Worked with those guys through 4 years, really built up their business. And I don't know if you remember, there was a game, one of the big hit games was Lemmings. Lemmings.
Oh, yeah.
You might you might remember it because you were at that time probably about 15 or so, early.
Yep.
So
I played it on my Amiga 500.
So that's the other story. The Amiga was the successor essentially to Atari, and I used to carry Amiga products, and I knew a lot of the Amiga developers, and Amiga, the Amiga 500, and there was the next one was the 2000 or something, and then there was another iteration of the Amiga.
They did the 3000. They did the 3000. Then they updated the chipset. Finally, they made a leap in the technology, but that wasn't until I think 93, 94, or 92, maybe even.
Atari was trying to compete with them, and the Atari was the Atari ST.
Yeah.
The Atari and the Amiga were kind of running. It was kind of interesting because, the people who started Commodore 64 was a guy named Trammell. Trammell and Gould, I think, was the guy who was there. And and there's another interesting side story there too. But they had a falling out, and Trammell went, and then Atari folded essentially, and got bought by the next iteration of Activision. Right, it wasn't the original Activision guys. It was a whole different group of Activision people. So Trammell bought the Atari brand, and he's the one that developed the ST. The Atari 400 and 800 were still when that company was owned by Warner Communications, and then they got spun off, and Trammell left Commodore, bought the Atari name, and started the whole ST line, ST 500, 1000, and then Gould started the Amiga. So they were competing. They were competing directly with each other. So that was, kind of an interesting time, and that was right around the late 80s and the early 90s. I'm kind of running off, but
no. It's I lived through it because as a Commodore 64 kid, I didn't know anything about what was happening in the background with the Tramiels. All I knew was this is the new machine from Commodore. It's much cheaper than my buddy's DOS machine, which cost a small fortune, and I can plug it into a TV if necessary. So I'm buying an Amiga, and I stuck with that for way longer than I probably should have, but I was on a budget, so that was my machine. And Psygnosis was the premier developer in England for the Amiga for a long time.
Yes, absolutely. And that was the guys that did Lemmings was DMA Design, who were in Dundee, Scotland.
Yeah,
one of their first games. But before they did that, their big breakthrough game was a game called Menace. That used the Amiga. The Amiga had all sorts of video and sound chips and so on. You could do some pretty cool stuff with the Amiga. So that was the evolution, of that story, because Infocom was bought by the new iteration of Activision.
Yeah, Mediagenic. That's what it's called.
Right. That's right. Exactly. So you know then that was started essentially by Bobby Kotick. And Bobby Kotick is now mega, I don't know, probably billionaire at this point. Because he does Call of Duty. What's the name of the guy?
I'm trying to rename the name of the development house, but I think right now they have two different.
The publisher,
Yeah, Activision. Yeah.
Right. But interestingly, interesting satellite was that I remember when Bobby Kotick, and I knew him actually quite well when he was still a kid, But really? I remember the first the trade show that we used to go to was the Consumer Electronics Show, and we only started, our software business only started going there like in 80 or 81, and there were two big shows, one in January in Las Vegas and one in Chicago in June, and that's where 100,000 people would come to these shows, and that's where all the latest electronics were shown and so on. So we got a small corner of that, our business, until E3 started in the early 90s. But I remember in the probably around maybe 84, 85, being at a CES, and Bobby Kotick and because he was going to school, I think, in Michigan State, and he and his roommate, I think, they had started some sort of database, and he really connected with Gould, the guy that was running Commodore. So he got a lot of attention, and essentially, that's how he got involved in the computer business. So he had a really tight relationship with Gould, and then he developed a really tight relationship with Steve Wynn. The guy who Steve Wynn is one of the big movers and shakers in the gambling business. in Las Vegas, and a couple of the really, really large hotels and gambling casinos in Las Vegas and in Reno, where Steve Wynn, and then also they just built a casino here in Boston that opened last year, and but that's where he got a connection to money in a big way. He got a connection to, I think his father was a stockbroker, I don't remember, but he got connected into the whole financing system. And then he bought the remnants of Activision for, I don't know, maybe $7 or $8 million. That was it. Wow. He was able to raise that money. And then he grew the business from there. So, they're a powerhouse. They're one of the top 3 companies.
Oh, yeah. They're huge. I mean, I think for a little while they were even bigger than EA, although I think EA has taken that slot back now. But yeah, crazy.
So it's like I remember when it was just kind of a kid running around, and the database they had was called. No, it was a word processor. It's called Jane.
Jane. Okay.
Name Jane. Right.
Wow.
Anyway.
So, yeah.
Old grizzled guy story from the old days.
Hey, no. I love this stuff. You have no idea. I'm like in seventh heaven right now. Okay, so you're going to CES and so forth. You're representing Psygnosis at this point. Are you actually running a subsidiary of Psygnosis? Or are you doing this as a free agent? What is your exact relationship with the company?
It was a handshake relationship. I wasn't a Psygnosis employee. I was essentially their agent, but I had an organization. I had about a half a dozen people in the United States that were. We did a lot of localization of Psygnosis products. We designed some of the packaging for the United States. We did platform conversion. So, for example, Lemmings, Psygnosis was not interested in doing Lemmings for the Apple or for the PC. And I said, you got to do it for the PC because this market is really exploding. And I think you do well on Apple. And they said, no, we don't want to do it. And I said, I'll do it. So I got some people involved, and we did the Apple and PC versions, and the PC version just like absolutely exploded. And then we did all kinds of one of the things that we did with Lemmings was we did all kinds of value packs. So you'd go into CompUSA. You remember CompUSA?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, some of the big stores, and we would do things like seasonal Lemmings. So if you remember, Lemmings had different puzzles and so on. So we'd do Christmas Lemmings. It'd be like 30 levels, and they all had to do with Christmas, and they were packed in small packs, self-merchandising. So we'd ship boxes to them. They just opened the box and put the display right on the checkout counter. It's $14.95, and it was a little 6x6 box with the Lemmings picture on it. And, so it was all these kind of innovative merchandising techniques about and playing with pricing and the kind of packaging that would work, that would work for us. So those are the kinds of things that I did with Psygnosis, and we really, really built their business. And I also was instrumental in getting Psygnosis hooked up with some Japanese companies that allowed them to do some of the first CD-based product. Psygnosis did some of the first CD-based product that was based on, cutscenes, because what ended up happening is if you kind of look at the evolution of game design, there was real-time gaming, and then there was a period for about maybe 3 or 4 years where CDs became the distribution mechanism or the distribution medium. And the way games were designed they have some live action, you do a lot of stuff on the game, and then you get to a cutscene. So let's say you finished a level let's say you're doing a space game, you finish a level, and then it goes to the cutscene, and you see this fantastically rendered, ships going off into the stars and, battles and so on. But you can't do anything there. You're just watching some entertainment. And then from there, you get put into the next level. So the graphics aren't the same, but you get this feel for these really rich graphics that the cutscenes were able to provide. And then through the 90s, as the video chips became more and more and more robust, the development actually started to go away from the cutscenes because the hardware was capable of creating this stuff in real time, 3D stuff in real time. And the breakthrough game there, of course, was Doom. Doom was the big leap forward into real time point of view gaming.
Of course. And so you're still representing Psygnosis. Are you there when Sony makes their offer to purchase the studio or the company? Sorry,
I wasn't in on the meeting, but I was there. Yes, I know. And one of the reasons that they did that, primary reason, was the stuff. Two things. One, the work that that Psygnosis had done with CD development. Because Sony was one of the largest manufacturers of CDs. Okay, the guy running that was a guy from Iceland, and I'm trying to remember. I can't remember his name. It was a very Icelandic kind of name, and he connected. We were at a show, and he came over and connected with the guys from Psygnosis. Two guys, the founders of Psygnosis, a guy named Hetherington and Ellis, and he connected with them, and they started having these conversations. Sony was just in the process of developing the PlayStation, and the PlayStation was going to deliver their product on a CD, right? So he realized the guy running the CD operation, who then inherited the Sony PlayStation activity, that he realized that Hetherington, who was the head of the development, had great contacts into the development community in England and in Europe. So the conversation was around, hey, we're working on this new hardware. We're going to need titles. You guys are working on the CD stuff, so you got a head start. You know what you're doing in that category. You also seem to have really good connections with the development community in England especially. So how do we make this work? And they said, buy us. So that's essentially what happened. That's how that process happened. They bought Psygnosis, and Psygnosis existed within Sony for a couple of years as a brand. But they were very, Hetherington especially was very instrumental in getting some of the key games that they needed. One of the key games always in Europe was Formula One. You had to have a Formula One racing game. Not in the U.S. as much, but certainly in Europe. Then you had to have a soccer game. You had to have a football game. So those are the games there were probably half a dozen to a dozen titles. Psygnosis did some of those titles that were sold under the Psygnosis brand also. But like I say, once they got acquired by Sony, Sony asked me to come and work with them. This guy who was involved in acquiring Sony, he and I had a good relationship. He asked me to come to New York and work with him, but I didn't want to work for a big company. I just saw so many incredible inefficiencies in large companies. I just didn't want to do it. So that was my role. I played I think a key role in helping them get established in the North American market, which gave them some cachet and there's knowledge about them. And I also helped them put together this initial relationship with the Japanese. Actually, it was Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi had a computer called the FM Towns that had an integrated CD mechanism, and that's that was the big breakthrough for Psygnosis.
Yeah, I've seen online videos of a lot of those ports of games that I knew from the Amiga days, Shadow of the Beast and so forth,
Right.
and these FM Town versions.
Was a key. As a matter of fact, I can tell you for a fact that Shadow of the Beast was the game that the guy that I knew, that I connected with Psygnosis, got his attention. The guy at Mitsubishi, who was actually an American Asian guy who was located in San Francisco. Oh. Shadow of the Beast was the game that he was absolutely crazy about and caused the the connection with Psygnosis.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, yeah, for the time, it was just visually stunning.
Yeah, it was a fabulous game. Yeah.
Curiously enough, somebody's actually porting it to the Atari 2600 right now.
Oh,
but that's some fan is making an Atari 2600 version of it. It's insane looking, but it works. Okay, so when you're working with did you have any run-ins with Imagine prior to the formation of Psygnosis, back when you were importing games or bringing in product?
No. This was after Imagine imploded. Probably, I mean, it was my first visit to England. They used to have a computer show in September, and I don't remember the name of the show, but it was down in the there was a show venue called Kensington somewhere in Kensington. And then
Kensington Court, I think.
No, it wasn't. It was something Court, but it wasn't Kensington Court. Anyways, that was where they had this thing, and it was a consumer show. So it wasn't like CES just for the trade. It was a consumer show because the industry wasn't big enough to just have a trade show. So they had consumers in there, and I went just on a chance of what is there out there, just to kind of see what might be available. And I was really happily surprised to find this extensive activity. Most of the platforms were unfamiliar to me because they were all the machines we talked about, the Acorn, the BBC, there were a couple of others there. But that's where I ran into Psygnosis, and also another thing that I had discovered there was that people were making alternative hardware, and the big hardware, the big forward leap in hardware was replacement of the Atari joystick. The joystick was, it was okay, but they would break. So one of the first pieces of hardware that were out there were replacement joysticks that actually had better quality components to them. So I think I may have brought some of those in as well, but I don't remember. That was a big deal. People wanted joysticks that were more durable.
I do remember in the U.S. It did seem like there was a bit of a dearth of joysticks back in the day in comparison with Europe. But then again, that was probably just because everybody there was a larger portion of people playing on consoles in the States, so the market just wasn't that big for the old 9-pin connectors.
Yeah. The other issue, of course, was the size of the market. I remember having conversations about how, and with Psygnosis, as a matter of fact, it was let me step back for a second. What ended up happening in the UK and other parts of Europe as well, the philosophy in Psygnosis was, let's have as much game development in development as we possibly can. We'll line up 10 companies, 2, 3, 4 guys each. We'll just have them producing stuff all the time. And as soon as we think it's ready, we're going to put it out on the market. And what they were anticipating was essentially a short shelf life. It was going to be a month, it was going to be 2 months. And from our perspective, in the United States, our market was so much larger, geographically so much more difficult to get to. You had to plan ahead of time. And they were using kind of the metrics of the English and the European markets. You know, in England, if you released a new game, you could have merchandising people travel throughout the UK, and you could have every major shop on High Street merchandise. You know, they'd come in and set up the displays and so on, because you can drive from one end of the country to the other in 10 hours, you know, and you can't do that. And that was always a struggle. It's like, listen, guys, this works for your market where you can have short shelf life because you can replace it very easily at relatively low cost and be very effective with the merchandising that you did in those stores. Couldn't do that in America because it very rapidly, from mom and pop stores, very rapidly became a large retailer event. And as we have just discussed, those required, you know, months and months and quarters of planning before you could put those products in. That was a real disconnect, kind of a business cultural disconnect that we always struggled with. So what ended up happening is Psygnosis actually had a lot of games that were crap games. They weren't really great. There were some great ones in there, but there were a lot of other games that weren't. And I would go over and we'd have our meetings about, well, this is what's in development. And I'd say, holy shit, guys. I mean, you know, this isn't, you know, not good enough. And it wasn't, it's like, hey, we're going to put it out there. If it's reasonably playable, we're going to put it out there. And if it lasts 4 weeks, great. We'll make our money on that. And we're moving the next one in. So that was a big difference.
Yeah, so you really had to take on a role of being the selector for the product.
Yeah. I mean, there's some products that we didn't bring into the States because it just didn't make sense.
And were you just using your own personal judgment on this, and or did you? Again, I've asked the question before, but was there some kind of system for that decision-making process?
No, it was all seat of the pants, and they were people whose judgment I trusted. You know, I had a reasonable sense of judgment about that, but there were people who were much better than I was around, you know, really getting the sense of a game. So I had some trusted people that either worked for me or that I knew that I could discuss the products with. But that was always a struggle, you know, and it continues to be. Anywhere, it's okay, how do we make the decision that this is really a good game? What goes into it? I mean, that's the secret sauce, you know, that you constantly struggle about mastering.
True. And did Psygnosis ever attempt to sell the products that you weren't picking up for U.S. distribution through some other channel, or to rebrand them and sell them someplace else?
No, we were the North American publishing arm of Psygnosis. So sometimes I have to take products that I didn't think were going to do well, and they said, "Well, you've got to take them, and because we need to move these products," and I would take them, but I wasn't happy about it.
Any particular title that you can remember in that category?
You know, unfortunately, I just can't.
No problem. No problem.
I mean, I can recall some of the images, but I just don't remember the names. Maybe it's because I wanted to forget them. You know?
Well, as somebody who played plenty of really, really terrible Psygnosis games, I could probably rattle off a few names. There's Obliterator, there was Terror Pods, there was Carthage. Oh, that one was absolutely broken.
Well, you know, the other thing that happened was that I didn't think that the QA was as robust as it should have been. You know, they were buggy. And the other problem that I recall was that the punters in the UK were willing to put up with a lot of crap, you know, so the games were not fine-tuned. And what ended up happening is that what I discovered was that if you had a game that had a very steep learning curve or difficulty curve, the punters in the UK would put up with it. They just pound away and pound away and pound away, and they'd find a way to, you know, whether they were getting cheat codes or whatever it might be. In the US, if a game didn't have a nice ascending glide path, it could fail very quickly because people would get frustrated and they didn't have the patience to stay with it and pound away at it. That was one of the really defining characteristics. I think the gamers in the UK were they had more tenacity and were willing to struggle with the game for longer until they got to the kind of the payoff stage, and then they could move ahead more rapidly. In the US, if you didn't have a game that was kind of relatively easy to get through, it wasn't going to succeed.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, we often talk nowadays about, especially games on the NES and so forth, being very, very difficult. But that was the strength of the Japanese designs at the time, that a well-designed game may have been super, super hard, but it never felt unfair.
Yeah.
And the European games, while they didn't usually have a producer role, they didn't have a designer role. It was just the programmers making the levels. And that ended up with games that were fly by the seat. They may have had an interesting idea, some good artwork, but the game levels were not thought out enough to be able to give you that experience of, I'm not just banging my head against the wall until I bleed.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, yes. Just thinking back to childhood trauma now, actually. And this is a little bit of a side note, but I am curious, as the person who was trying to sell the software, what was it like having to try to sell the Amiga and Atari ST versions of that software in the United States, given the popularity of those systems in the U.S.?
Well, it was a pretty specialized market, quite frankly, because in the United States, one of the big dynamics that was different from what happened in Europe is the dominant video game machines were consoles, so the consoles were, in 1984, after the death of Atari, Nintendo. That's where Nintendo really made its first move. Nintendo had that killer arcade game, Donkey Kong, and then they created the Nintendo console, and what sold that console was people could play Donkey Kong, and Donkey Kong was the start of Nintendo in America. So the console business in America for about 2 years was pretty dead. It was fallow. And before that, Coleco was the first machine, and then it became Atari, and Atari, owned that business, and then third-party developers like iMagic and Activision. But on the hardware side, it was Nintendo from about 85 on, and until the PlayStation came on board in 91 or 92, I don't remember.
No, 95.
PlayStation was 95 was the first one. Okay, right. So the first PlayStation. Until then, Nintendo really owned the console business. It's only and that's why they got into it. That's why Sony got into it, because they saw that Nintendo absolutely owned the world on that. People would come on bended knee to Nintendo. It was the time where you wanted to be, if you wanted the best job in the world, it was to be the Nintendo rep, because that's the way they sold. They sold through sales reps around the United States, because all you had to do was go to these very, very large retailers and say, I got the next product, but you're on allocation. It's like, right. So it's not like, hey, can I convince you to take another 50,000 of these? They were calling the reps. All of those buyers were calling the reps, begging for more product. So it was absolutely a wonderful time to be a Nintendo sales rep.
Oh, man. And did you ever try to get any of Psygnosis' product onto the NES back then?
Psygnosis, yeah, they tried to do it, but it wasn't, Psygnosis never, although that wasn't my I didn't try to do that. That wasn't one of the initiatives that I was involved in because the console business, didn't. I wasn't directly involved in the console business in any way, so I didn't have the connections. I knew some of the guys in Nintendo, but I never had those kinds of connections. Ultimately, they did make stuff for the Nintendo, but it was never the Nintendo stuff was never of any consequence. It was
Gotcha.
all, PlayStation was the primary platform that they developed for.
Hmm.
I don't remember the original question. I'm running into mouth.
Yeah, no. The original question was about trying to sell Amiga and ST software.
So the reason I went into this whole story is that the games business was owned by the consoles, and we sold PC software by this time, PC, Amiga, ST, Apple, but the biggest category from about, after Amiga, and the place where we made most of it was PC, because PC games became the dominant force, and it played to Psygnosis' strengths, which was graphics, so that as soon as these new graphics chips started to become available, they would do one mistake. Sega, of course, was the competition. There was Nintendo had Sega was competition, and Sega and Psygnosis actually started to work with Sega pretty closely. It was maybe about '92 or so when the Genesis machine came out, because the Genesis had a built-in CD player as well. So that one thing I forgot about. So they were in the console business with Sega, but Sega, that didn't last terribly long.
Yeah, they were gone pretty fast. But yeah, I believe I remember Shadow of the Beast 2 and maybe Microcosm both getting ports to the Mega C or Genesis Sega CD in the States, Mega CD in Europe.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So you decide not to go to the big company Sony.
Right.
What do you do then?
Well, I joined a startup called Looking Glass Technologies.
Okay.
And Looking Glass Technologies was, had come. It was an evolution from a company called Blue Sky Software, and it was a guy named Paul Neurath and Ned Lerner that had been working together, and they decided to try to grow the company. So they got some VC money, and the VC guys said, "You need somebody in here that knows the business side of this thing." So somehow I got connected to them because they're in the Boston area. And I went and talked to them, and they said, "Hey, would you come on board? Because the VCs say we need a guy like you." And I, looked at what they were doing, and they had some really innovative stuff. They had some great developers, some really, really sharp MIT guys working there. And their first product was going to be a flight simulator, aerobatic flight simulator, that was based on some real breakthrough physics stuff that they were working on. And I said, "Yeah, okay, sure, let's do it." And I got excited about that, and they got the VC money, and they started to develop the product, and that's a whole other story. But that's essentially where I ended up, and I was with those guys for maybe 2 or 3 years, and then I left there and worked with startups. Took time off every once in a while, and then worked with smaller developers who needed money, who needed some advice on how to get to the next step, and so on. And most of those projects were all, projects where I would work with them and do it for a piece of equity, and some of them worked and some of them didn't.
So your role at all these companies was to help them with, were you working with the development of the software at this point, or just the business side of dealing with publishers and distribution?
It was the business side primarily. I mean, sometimes I got involved in design but only from a marketing perspective. It's like, it doesn't make sense to make this product in this category. This is what products look like in this category. This is what we ought to be shooting for. But I was never specifically involved in managing code development or game design, other than from a really kind of a mega level.
Gotcha.
But it was all business. It was all organizing the structure of the organization, trying to get money, because that was always an issue. Get the thing funded, developing distribution, publishing relationships with who was going to carry the product, retailers, distributors. So that was the role I played.
And so in this period, mid to late 90s, what does the financing side for a PC game developer look like?
At this time, in the late 90s, it still was. It still followed the model that was kind of set up in the late 80s, early 90s, which was a publisher like Psygnosis would find developers and fund them, and say, listen, we'll buy your game. We'll give you £15,000 or £10,000. You deliver this game to us in 6 months, and we'll publish it. And what we pay you is an advance on royalties. Okay, so it was always an advance on royalties, and once we recoup, then your percentage will be at 7%, 10%, whatever the deal was. Mm-hmm. Console royalties were always at a much lower rate because there was so much more of the consoles that were sold, and those are typically wholesale prices. Whatever price the distributor was getting, it wasn't, or the publisher was getting, it wasn't based on retail price. We'll give you 4% or 5%. On PC products, they were anywhere from 10 to 15% royalties. But in the vast majority of the cases, they were advances against royalties, and that's essentially how developers got funded. If the developers showed that they were real producers and understood, then the publisher would try to acquire them. But it was really kind of interesting because it was very inexpensive in the late 80s, early 90s. You could buy access to all of the development capacity in England for like $200,000 or something like that, because these guys would, they were 2-3 guys working in somebody's garage in Sheffield, developing a game, and if they got 10 or 15,000 pounds, doled out, they were in heaven. I mean, these, so it was very inexpensive to create and to buy these games that were being done, particularly in England and in Germany as well. Germany, France, those are the three companies that were producing most of the product.
Yeah, and just for my own understanding, because I've often read about studios getting purchased and so forth, when a publisher purchases a studio, especially back then, when the teams are relatively small, what exactly is the publisher purchasing? Because we often hear about the developers leaving or key personnel leaving shortly after the purchase. If you were witness to any of these, what does the contract, what are standard provisions for these kind of contracts? How long do people have to stay there? What rights are they is a publisher actually acquiring when they buy a studio?
That's a very insightful question, because it's a question that plagued the industry. And I would say, I'm going to guess, half, if not more than half, of acquisitions were failures. It's specifically for the reason that there's no way you really can hold on to talent unless they want to work there. So when you buy a development house, let's say DMA was never actually acquired, but if you were to acquire DMA, or any of the really innovative studios in England, for example, there was no way of really making sure that the people who were running the studio would stay. You try to build it in and say, it's much more sophisticated now. Now it's like, okay, we're gonna pay you in equity, and we're gonna pay you some cash, and your equity is not going to vest for 4 years. You'll have maybe cliff vesting where you won't get any of the equity for the first 2 years. We'll give you enough cash to make you happy, but you're not going to get any of the equity for the first 2 years. After your first 2 years, you'll get 50%. And then maybe there'll be a sliding scale. So at the end of 4 years, you'll own the equity that's in the deal. But a lot of acquisitions failed for that reason. And one of the other problems was that there was always tension between the suits and the developers, in an organization. The people who were the business people who were running it and so on, there was always this, the developers always looked at those people with suspicion. They are the slick guys in the suits and the shirts and ties, and they go out there and promise the world, and then we have to do it. And, so there's a lot of tension between that. And what ended up happening is that most of the companies were actually run by suits. And if they acquired a company, a studio that, was an innovative, energetic studio, unless they knew how to manage, and those studios a lot of times were remote. So you have Acclaim in Long Island in New York buying a company in England, a small development studio. And so there was this communication thing, and they didn't know how to manage those guys. They didn't know what made those people create, exciting new games and so on. So what ended up happening is that they failed because they didn't know how to manage them. They thought that if they acquired them, they would just, the golden goose, they just keep producing, it would happen automatically. And they never put in place a real senior development infrastructure that could manage multiple studios. Early on, the company that did it successfully was EA. They bought a sports development house up in Vancouver. The other company that's done very well with that was Ubisoft. Ubisoft, started. I know the guys from Ubisoft. They started out as a distributor. They were a distributor in France of video games, and they evolved from that into this powerhouse publishing company. But they did it successfully. And one of the companies they bought that they managed that process successfully was the guys that did Hunt for Red October and the games based on, who's the guy that wrote
Tom Clancy, the Tom Clancy novels, Red Storm, I think is the name.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, that was, I don't know if I answered your question. They tried to build some of those features into the contracts, but when you're dealing with creative people, that really doesn't, it's protection. It's protection. It's not innovation. It's not, it's not leadership. And these companies are run by lawyers and not,
Hey! Lawyers. We are the scum of the world. I completely accept that. It's okay.
Primarily focused on protection, right? If you hire a lawyer, you're hiring somebody to protect you in agreements and whatever it is that you're doing. And that was the focus of the lawyers. The lawyers their focus was protection. How do we make sure that we're acquiring this intellectual product that's really difficult to acquire? How do we protect it? How do we make sure that this person is going to create more of this intellectual product that we're going to be able to protect, and it's going to be ours, and nobody's going to steal it? Very difficult to do. Very difficult to do. So you could do non-competes, with people and so on, but enforcing non-competes. Oh, you know what that's like. I mean, they're very, very difficult. Different jurisdictions have different rules. So it was very hard to do a successful acquisition. You really had to understand what went into it. And it wasn't about signing contracts. It was about understanding how you manage and lead creative people.
Gotcha. And that does answer my question. Thank you. So you're bouncing around from one developer to the next. Are you?
I wouldn't say I was bouncing around. I would pick the opportunities. You
would pick the opportunities. Now, are you finding out about these opportunities through VCs that are recommending you, or is this more just general networking?
I think it was general networking. VCs at that time was still, they were pretty, the first place you go, if you want to get money for a company, first place you go is to a publisher. Because you want to do an advanced deal. It's like anybody who wants to make a movie. They don't go to a VC. They go to a studio, right? They go to a studio. Yeah. Same thing with the music business. It was not now so much because that's different. That model has changed. But when the music business was in its explosive heyday, you went to Warner, you went to Columbia, you went to, those are the people that are going to fund new artists. That's where you went. VC started to get into the picture when it became really, really big business. Probably early 90s when VCs and when the CD console business really started going. Late 90s, early 2000s, and then it evolved from there. VCs, the big thing with VCs is show me recurring revenue. If you can show me a recurring revenue model, I'm interested in talking to you. But until you can show me that, what guarantees that your next product is going to be the next hit? That was their attitude. Very, very conservative.
Gotcha. And normally looking at it from the outside, you don't think of VC as being conservative. That's kind of the opposite of what a VC should be.
Yeah. But they didn't know how to predict. There was no predictive model that would say, okay, I can assess risk here. With unless it was a franchise product, didn't take a lot of brains to invest in John Madden after the third year. It's like, yeah, let me get on this train. It wasn't about John Madden, geez, who, But any new stuff was a crapshoot for them. And VCs don't do crapshoots unless they understand a little bit about the technology, a little bit about. But it wasn't technology driven. It wasn't. I mean, it was in the sense of what you saw, but it wasn't. It was about people's tastes. That's what made games successful.
So. Yeah, gotcha. So at some point, you make the transition from just doing business work for these developers to actually doing VC work yourself. How does that happen?
Just some angel investing. I've never been part of a VC firm, but I've made some money, and then I said, well, it might make sense to invest in, something that I know, the gaming world. And so I made about, 4 or 5, half a dozen investments in small startups. And, they weren't large investments. They were $25,000, $30,000, that sort of thing, just at a startup level. Because that was usually very, very early. So that's what I did. And, I wasn't particularly successful in that, quite frankly. It was okay, but it didn't, there were no unicorns in there for me. I did it also because I like doing it. I'm a grizzled guy, but I always liked the games business because it had a lot of young, enthusiastic people, and I was part of that ecosystem. I went to, a bunch of the developer events that went on in Boston and other places. I knew a lot of people in the development world, and they had a high regard for me. I always treated them well, when I was on the business side. And so I was recommended all the time to people, it was like go talk to Jerry. He can help you maybe take the next step. And I had a lot of those conversations. So that's basically what happened. Except for the thing with Ravensburger. With Ravensburger, I was recommended to those guys by a headhunter, actually, a guy I knew, and they had gotten in touch with him. They wanted to develop their North American publishing business, and he came to me. I flew to Munich, and then I went down to Ravensburg, beautiful area, and we hit it off. And they said, "Okay, we think you can do this. We'll trust you." So we actually got off to a great start. We had some good titles. We developed a brand called Fish Tank Software, and the problem was, but however, it folded. It folded after about 2 years because Ravensburg itself, the main company, got into some financial trouble, primarily because they expanded too rapidly. Doing their puzzles and books and so on. One of the places they ran into a big problem was in France. They built some production facilities, and then when they wanted to scale down, they ran afoul of French employment laws and so on, and all of a sudden they had this enormous cash drain, and we needed another $10-20 million to be invested in the software business in North America. And they said, and it was like, hey, we can't do it. So we shut it down. We shut it down in a very orderly way. Nobody got burned, nobody got hurt, but it was unfortunate. I think they could have been successful, but they just didn't have the money to do it.
Gotcha. Now, and I may have actually gotten this chronologically out of order. You were also involved with Harmonix.
Yes, but Harmonix got involved. Yeah. I knew when around the, like maybe 96, 97, I was approached by, I don't remember who was that. Maybe it was one of the developers working with two guys from MIT, the two guys that started Harmonix, and they were doing music software, and it was during the time I was working with smaller companies. They talked to me about coming on board and being like the COO. And I really liked the guys and so on, but I didn't have a lot of faith in the music software. I'd seen it tried on the Commodore 64, and there was a company here in Boston called Dr. T's, and there were other music software companies for creating music that were not particularly successful. And I declined and, went off and did something else. But I stayed in touch with the guys, and I was really friendly with them and so on. And they kept trying to grow their business. They did some contract work, and they were really, really smart guys, except and especially Alex Rogopoulos, who did the kind of business side, and Eran Agotzi did all of the software development. So anyway, I knew those guys. I went in every once in a while. They'd ask me to come in and do a small project for them. and then they got acquired by, and then they brought in a senior guy to be their COO, a guy named Mike Dornbrook, whom I knew very well from Infocom. And Mike was their CEO for about 10 years or so. And then they got acquired. They developed, the first Guitar Hero. Yeah. Developed the first Guitar Hero, made them an enormous amounts of money, really put them on the radar. They were like the 10-year overnight success, because those guys had been struggling for about 10 years and, existing. And they had about 30 developers working in the group. But like I say, I was always friends with them, and they would ask me to come in and help with small projects for a month and that sort of thing. And then when they got bought by Viacom, all of a sudden here was this thing that I described to you earlier, which was development group with about maybe 60 people, absorbed by this gigantic media company run by lawyers, and so they immediately ran into all sorts of bottlenecks, where they could get agreements worked out with sub-developers in 3 days. It's like, okay, we're going to send you a check, send us this and everything. All of a sudden, it was like everything ground to a halt. Oh. Right. So Mike Dornbrook got in touch with me. He said, "Listen, can you come and help us? We've got to work our way out of this morass." I said, "What do you want me to do? How long?" And he said, 2, 3 months. You can work half time. Just help us get through some of these, develop some processes so we're not stuck all the time. And anyway, long story short, I ended up working with them full time for almost 3 years.
Oh,
60 hours a week.
jeez.
Because the big issue that we ended up getting involved in was manufacturing. They did Rock Band, and they had to all of a sudden start manufacturing millions and millions of devices in China, and they had to do that with a media company. The guys at Viacom, even though they were a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar company, those guys had never done letters of credit. They didn't. That's not the way they treated it intellectual property. That was their business. So just setting up systems for manufacturing and so on took a long time, but we got stuff moving very, very quickly. But that's why it just kind of sucked me in immediately. And I like what they were doing, and it was interesting for me because I was learning a lot of new stuff. I was learning about Chinese manufacturing. I traveled there and so on. So that's how I got involved in Harmonix. My role in Harmonix was, evolved from a little small kind of help us with these administrative snafus to help us put together this logistical system that's going to help us manufacture stuff. So,
and you already touched on it, but I had my two questions about it were, number one, the manufacturing side, which would have been new for you as well. And I wanted to ask, what was probably the most surprising thing that you learned coming into that completely different aspect of doing business? And secondly, I was going to ask about the licensing issues for the music that was being used in Rock Band and the competition, obviously, with Guitar Hero, the other marquee brand. So I guess those are the two questions. But first off, what was the thing that most surprised you or caught you by surprise getting into the manufacturing side of things?
Well, one was the internal obstacles at Viacom. Just setting up because setting up the financing of manufacturing, which kind of led to the second surprise, and that was the speed with which Chinese companies could move to manufacture large quantities of stuff. They could scale up. That was one of the big shocks to me. They could scale up. There were a number of cases where we'd say, we need 2 million of these, and our assumption would be they'd never be able to deliver, and they could deliver in 2 months, or something like that. They could just, their contractual capacity to assemble was astounding, how quickly they could put that into play. And the other thing that was very, very interesting is that, I'll give you an example. Well, the first contract that we put together for manufacturing included lawyers from Viacom, which we immediately realized they were not the right lawyers because they were IP lawyers, So the next thing is they turn us on to a law firm in Hong Kong. Okay, and this law firm it's a trip dealing with these guys because everybody speaks with these heavy British accents, because that's where they were all trained. And we have these long conversations about designing these contracts for manufacturing that we realize that these guys haven't done. There might be a law firm in Hong Kong, but they haven't done manufacturing contracts. They are also IP lawyers, except they're Hong Kong IP lawyers. And so we come back to New York. We find some guys who have done some manufacturing, but not a lot, okay? And the Chinese manufacturers basically are saying, look, this is the way we do business. And we had an agent in China had done a lot of toy manufacturing. And he kept saying to us, don't waste your time on doing all these contracts. All these guys give them your design, come and talk to them. They'll make you a sample. They call it the golden sample. They'll make you a sample, You look at it, you approve it, they will, and then you say, make me 1,000,000 of these. And they will say, fine, pay us 25% by letter of credit. And as we deliver each one, there'll be a letter of credit. There's let's say, $500,000 each time that we deliver. You guys have your inspectors inspect. You do the QA. If we produce what is in the golden sample, you pay us. And that was it, right? He explained that to us, but the lawyers insisted on putting in all of this language about penalties and what would happen, and so, and it took. I remember we were working on this contract. It was 4th of July weekend, and I was on Cape Cod with my family, and I had bad cell phone connection, so I spent half of the time down there in my car in a place where I could get decent reception, going through these contracts, about the language in the contracts. And in the end, and it was about penalties, about if you didn't deliver on time, and this and that, complicated formulas on what would happen and how the payments would be reduced. And the Chinese guy was saying, yeah, sure. Well, we'll sign all of that stuff, right? And in the end, it's like, who was going to enforce it? How is it going, So in the end, It all simply came down to that formula. It was golden sample. Yes, this is it. It's incumbent on you to put together a really robust QA activity, because you can have your people on the floor in the factory. You can have them inspect when we deliver. But once they inspect and they say, that's it, then we just go to the bank. And the bank you've established a letter of credit with the bank for $5 million. And if we deliver and your guys sign off, then we're going to the bank and we want to get paid. And that's the way it went after that, So all of that time that was wasted developing these contracts just sort of, went totally away. And it was that they deliver, they meet the QA standards, the guys get paid.
Awesome. Absolutely awesome.
It was a real surprise to me because I was expecting all sorts of, it was like, it's the way people have done business for millennia, When the silk guys came with their camels, it's like, you got silk for me? Yeah. What do you got for me? I got this. All right, we're done. And that was it.
Oh, that's amazing. Oh, okay. And then I guess the IP side of this, the licensing of music and so forth. How did that work? Was that worked out before you showed up? And what was the role of Viacom in that entire mess?
It was something I was not involved in, but it was the activity that Viacom took over. So that's what Viacom did. That's what they were good at. And the guy who did the licensing was actually a Viacom guy who worked very closely with Alex Rogopoulos. And Alex was the guy that held together the relationship, in Viacom. He was very highly regarded in Viacom, and he got to talk when, if I ran into a problem or some of us ran into a problem, we couldn't solve it, we'd finally say to Alex, you got to talk to the big kahuna, in Viacom, and then we get things done. But he was highly respected. He actually was the one who made all the Beatles products happen because of his attitude, his knowledge about music, and Iran Agotzi, who was head of development. Both of them MIT guys. Both of them came out of Media Lab. And Iran actually is still on the board at Harmonix, but he's on the faculty at MIT. He teaches a course in music, computers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I don't know much about the licensing, but there was a constant activity for licensing because that was one area where there was direct competition with Activision, and the other area there was direct competition with Activision was store space, floor space. Who's going to duke it out? And it really, in the end, it was this destructive competition that destroyed the category. I mean, for 3 or 4 years, this was like an explosive category of products. And really, I kind of lay it at the feet of Bobby Kotick, because he just would not let go. You know, there's an interesting story there. They acquired Red Octane Software, who are the guys that actually developed who came up with the idea of Guitar Hero. Then they had the development done by Harmonix, but Red Octane was the brand that was selling Guitar Hero. Yeah. And Activision came in and said, we want to buy you. And they did a shitty job of understanding the whole ecosystem of where the product came from. And they never really made a serious attempt to acquire Harmonix as well. And Harmonix's agreement with Red Octane, Harmonix retained a lot of the rights to the technology. And that's Alex's work. He was very good at understanding what that was all about. So they bought Red Octane, but they didn't buy all of the rights, all of the intellectual property rights. So Harmonix got acquired by Viacom, all of a sudden had the means to capitalize tens of millions of dollars worth of manufacturing, and and the competition was born. And they had the first product. Rock Band was the first band product out there, and yeah. I think that if Bobby had been more flexible in trying to understand how this market, maybe we can both coexist here. It wasn't like that. It was, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah.
One of us, and I'm going to kill you. So.
And I remember it was an insane amount of peripherals, an insane amount of add-on discs, and the fact that the peripherals were not compatible with one another.
All of it.
Really, I mean, yeah, it felt as a consumer like it just a bit wasteful. I mean, because if you wanted certain songs on there, you just couldn't do it. And then when the 360 showed up with the download capabilities, it just felt like a missed opportunity to create a standardized platform, create an iTunes marketplace, and keep that entire category going, because it would have survived, I think, for several more generations.
Absolutely. I think it fulfilled. People really liked playing it. They liked playing it. And they, it was, there were two parties to it, and it may sound like I have, a biased view of it, but I know a little bit about Bobby. That's his style. His style is to dominate, and so he was going to duke it out, and they did, and they both lost.
Seems such a waste.
Yeah.
So, okay, and I have to admit, after Harmonix, there's very little information online about you and your activities. I don't know if this is by design or not, but where does the voyage take you after Harmonix?
After Harmonix, I still did some, have been doing some work with some startups, but I'm basically retired now. I go in and talk to people and so on. So at some point, things kind of really slowed down after. Essentially what happened was that my wife said, all those trips you were promising that we're going to take, I want to take them. Calling it my chips.
That's cool.
And that's essentially what happened. Some of the things that I did get involved in one project directly when Apple came out with smartphones. All of a sudden, the whole apps world exploded. So I was involved in one project that was doing kind of interactive stories on handheld smartphones. And the idea was to create a creative platform that would allow the creative platform would allow the creation of these stories, right? So authors, writers would have a tool set that they could use that would allow them to recreate their stories as interactive stories on smartphones. It was called a company called StoryTap Media, but it failed. It failed because the platform, the guy that was doing the platform, who was primarily involved in it, really talked a better game than what he was able to produce. So that was my last real project that I was involved in, which was about maybe 10 years ago. And then I've made, like I say, I've made a couple of additional investments in some small, startup companies, game companies. So that's basically it. So I've been kind of low key since then.
Cool, but it's been actually an amazing journey through the industry and all the changes. I got to ask one question here. Well, two questions, actually. First one is, looking back at all of it, what development would you say caught you most by surprise, successful development in the industry? And what thing that you expected to be big just never really caught on?
Interesting question. What caught me by surprise? I think one of the development of the CD, the integrated CD, was something that happened very, very quickly and really changed the nature of what kind of graphics people could expect. And so that happened very, very quickly. So that was one. The other one was what disappointed me, essentially. I think my big disappointment was the failure of Atari and Commodore. And I think that failure really was that the people who were running those companies didn't have the vision or understand what those computers could be. From a hardware basis, the Atari was a much better computer than the Apple. It had much more sophisticated hardware. It had sprites, it had audio, it had all of those things. But Warner Communications at the time, it was a conglomerate that owned Atari. Warner was totally bedazzled and infatuated by the VCS. They didn't understand or see the potential of personal computers. So they lost. They could have had a lead because it was a much better machine that could have been introduced much more easily into households in America. And they always kept it a closed system, and they never paid attention to it. And a similar thing happened to Commodore. Although Commodore was very successful in Europe. And I think one of the things I was going to mention is that the Commodore system, when I was talking about consoles, Commodore system was the development system for European developers, in the mid to late 80s. And then the Amiga became the development system. And anybody could buy one. Anybody could buy one. You could go out and buy one. You could be making games. Couldn't do that in America. You couldn't do that with the development systems that Nintendo wanted you to have. And so it was completely closed system. So I think that was a real disappointment for me. I think they could have been successful.
And believe me, as a person who owned an Amiga all the way up until 1996, I can completely and totally concur with that. Yep. Okay, I guess that concludes the interview. Thank you very, very much for your time. This has really been a fascinating view of a side of the industry that doesn't get talked about enough.
My pleasure.
Jerry and I kept a conversation going after our interview, and during that conversation we started talking about some of his memories of the old West Coast Computer Faire. So as a follow-up to our interview on September 10th, 2020, we talked again specifically about more details of that event. Here's that pickup section of the interview.
Well, we were going to talk about
Yes.
the West Coast Computer Faire,
Yeah.
and it's kind of interesting because I don't know if you saw the stories or the pictures online of San Francisco these days. There's all these forest fires raging in San Francisco. Is this kind of reddish Mars-looking atmosphere, but it was very different when I went. I was a newbie, and I was just getting started in the whole video games business and so on. My brother had gotten involved in it first, and he said, you need to come out to the West Coast Computer Faire. Our company, Synapse, we're doing a booth, and we're going to, you'll learn a lot about how this whole thing operates. And I already had sold some of their stuff, as I had explained to you before, some of the smaller dealers, games in baggies, TRS-80 games, that kind of thing. So I said, okay, I'll come out. And
Now, which year are we talking here?
This is probably around maybe 81, something like that. Yeah, spring of 81. And the West Coast Computer Faire typically took place around middle of March, somewhere in that range. So I flew out there, stayed with him, and it was, I'm trying to remember what the venue was. It wasn't Moscone Center because that wasn't built yet, but some large show venue. If I went back, I could probably identify. But the cool part about it was that it was everybody from the microcomputer. I'm calling it microcomputer, personal computer business. And this was actually before the IBM PC. So it was packed with people who had Trash 80s, Ataris, Apples, kit computers, Altairs, all of these kit computers there. And the game companies were just starting to emerge. So Bruderbund Software, Sierra Online, Ken and Roberta Williams, the Carlston brothers, Doug and Gary Carlston, a company called Datasoft. Let me think. I'm not sure if Automated Simulations was in existence yet, but those are some of the names that come to mind. So you show up there, and everybody's little. Nobody's a big business yet. Everybody shows up, and they're building their booths. And you walk around, and there's Gary Carlston with a hammer and a pair of pliers. They're putting up their booth, and people go over to Sierra Online. It's the same sort of thing, and people are borrowing stuff from each other. Hey man, I need a hammer. I need we ran out of staples. We got the stapler. We got to put up our stuff, and everybody's kind of cooperating and talking to each other. And then after the setup, people end up going to same bars. So you're meeting these people in the bars and yucking it up. It was really a fun time to be involved in, and that's actually how I got started. I got to know these guys. I was helping do the Synapse booth, and we're walking around meeting people, and they got to know me. So when I made my proposal to them, saying, hey, listen, you guys don't have distribution on the East Coast. Send me 100 pieces of your stuff and I'll sell it to you. And they said, okay, like I explained to you. And it was a handshake, and that was it. So it was really fun to do that. And then I had a similar experience the first time I went to the computer shows in England. There was a computer show in the fall, usually early September. And I don't remember exactly what it was called, but it was also, and these shows were, the ones in the West Coast Computer Faire, also retail shows, the public came in. And then in the UK, it was, they'd have a day of trade exhibits, and then the public would come in. But it was a similar situation. You know, the UK was very interesting because it was so small. So everybody, you know, everybody's within 8 hours of London driving time. So all the companies came there, even these little guys, you know, 2 and 3 guys from Sheffield and, you know, places like that.
Yeah.
And they showed up and they put up their booths. So they were trying to sell their stuff to some, you know, to like companies like Psygnosis. And, but it was a very similar kind of small business feel to it. And there, everybody also stayed in, like, you know, the main 2 hotels. So in the evening, you know, you'd meet people at bars, and especially in, you know, in European hotels, UK hotels, there's a bar. If there was a bar, it's in the lobby. So, you know, you're always meeting somebody, running into them in the evenings. There was a real camaraderie around the people who were there and the people who were involved in the industry. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, I can imagine. It almost seems like a magical fairy tale version of it. It's one of those things where, as a consumer, as a player of the games, where you idolize a lot of these people, where these names loom large.
Yeah.
A guy like me, that those names are the names on the credits of my childhood. Just imagining them all hanging out together, having a beer or something, just to be a fly on that wall I'd pay gold for that.
No, it was fun. It was fun. And, you know, and of course there was the usual anxiety before a show. You know, somebody's going to show some new stuff, and the night before it's crashing, it's not working. You know, people are desperately coding through the night, you know, coming in bleary-eyed after drinking and coding, and coming in the morning and hoping that everything is going to be okay, and they're not going to get hosed. You know, so
oh man,
it was it was fun to be involved in that.
Gotcha. Oh, this must have been amazing. So when you were out there in these shows and making these deals with these small producers, were any of the computer manufacturers also there? I mean, especially the smaller ones?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I just don't remember. But they had to be. You know, certainly Apple had to be there, because Apple, you know, the primary mover on Apple software was the user group from Berkeley. They were the guys that really supported Apple and did all sorts of new stuff. And the other thing that was happening is that people were making additions to Apple's, you know, expanded memory and so on. Apple was an open system, unlike Atari. You couldn't do anything with it. There were guys ultimately that started to make cards. You'd have to open up your computer. You could put additional memory in there, so on. But, you know, it would void the warranty. But people were absolutely doing all that stuff. I don't remember Atari being at the West Coast Computer Faire, but they may have been. They may have been. Apple certainly was there, because that was their following. You know, so they were definitely there. One of the companies that I do remember that was a large company, or large for that time, one of the first distributors in the business was a company called SoftCell. And SoftCell had a larger booth, and they were really, like, you know, professional. And you know, we were in awe of them, because they would come and, you know, and in the evening the limo would pull up and, you know, and pick them up. And it was like, oh man, you know, you sort of love-hate relationship with those guys. But so I remember SoftCell, and, you know, I'm sure that if I was going to prepare a little bit for you, but I just didn't have the time. I was going to look up West Coast Computer Faire, and I would have jogged my memory, you know, about some of the other companies that were there. But one of the categories was joystick manufacturers. Alternative joystick, because the primary joystick was the Atari joystick. And, you know, if you played with a card, if you played Star Raiders for too long, those joysticks would break. You know, they would break a lot, or they would malfunction. They would be intermittent problems with them. They weren't built for that kind of really, really heavy use. So one of the first categories of hardware improvements were joysticks. And people were building that. There was, some of them were homebrew. In a little metal case, but it was like a super heavy duty joystick with leaf springs and so on. So that was a big category. Controllers, and then just moving ahead from that, like in England, for example, one of the things that I did because I ran my distribution company at the time is I brought in alternative joysticks, and the other category was joysticks for Microsoft Flight Simulator, because Microsoft Flight Simulator, when the PC started coming in, that was one of the most popular applications. So that and also driving simulators, steering wheels, and you've seen them. I mean, there are whole setups that make you can sit in a chair. It feels like you're sitting in a Formula One car. But certainly that was one of the first categories of improvement and upgrading hardware that people did. They were simple to execute, and you basically had to buy heavy duty stuff, and people bought them because the Atari joysticks just break down very easily.
And it was also a category that most of the computer manufacturers didn't seem to be caring about.
Yeah, no, they didn't. That wasn't their thing. Or they weren't interested. They had enough of whatever business they were doing. And, so that was available, especially for Atari, because the Atari, like I said, was a closed system. There weren't a lot of opportunities to provide improvements for Atari machines.
That's true. And they did have 4 controller ports, so all the more chances to be able to sell joysticks.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, insane. Okay, so these joysticks, where were you sourcing them from? I mean, how did that work? Because obviously it's a lot more manufacturing than copying discs in cardboard boxes.
Yeah, it was, a lot of them were homebrew, so they weren't making tens of thousands. They had a wave soldering machine, and it was all assembled by, maybe they hired 3 or 4 assemblers, but it was all handmade stuff, basically. And
oh, wow.
Yeah. So it wasn't, they weren't, there was no such thing as Chinese manufacturing, because China didn't even exist yet as a manufacturing resource at that time. So whatever was being done, whatever printed circuit boards they needed to do, which were not very complicated. There were certainly places in the Silicon Valley, or in Sunnyvale, or any of those towns around San Jose, any of those towns around there, that could do small lots. That's what they were designed to do. So that's the way it typically went. There's a PC design that would go to a small jobber. He'd do the PC board, and then the stuff was assembled.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting. And I'm guessing that didn't last too long until more professionally manufactured sticks started showing up on the market.
Yeah. There was, people who had resources, people who knew manufacturing resources, knew how to manage manufacturing resources. A lot of the stuff initially was just homebrew stuff. I mean, the Atari, for example, some of the Atari games, I mean, they would have a bank of 8, 10 disk drives. These little, the little disk drives they'd have, they have 20 disk drives, and they'd be loading 5 1/4-inch disks, and that's how they manufactured this stuff. One of the interesting things was, which we touched upon in our previous discussions, was there's a lot of piracy. So what people try to do is, I know Synapse tried to do this with some level of success. They had dongles. They had dongles that would fit into the gaming ports, into the joystick ports, and the program would query, the existence of a dongle. But those got ripped off pretty quickly. But for a while, it was, one way of trying to prevent piracy. But that was a big problem. There was no protection. I mean, you got a disk. Yeah. You just copy it and give it to your friend.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm not going to say that I purchased all of my software legitimately back in the day.
Yeah, we talked about it, especially when you were in Argentina. Right.
What can I say? There was no proper distribution. We were missing a guy like you to distribute software.
Right. Well, that was exactly. And, and I remember having conversations with people complaining, and rightfully so, about the level of piracy. And I said, the only sure way of dealing with piracy is you got to address the needs of the marketplace. You got to make the pirated stuff more expensive than the regular stuff, and make it available, the regular stuff available instantaneously, very broadly distributed, because that's what people wanted with games. One of the issues was, I want the game, but it was also, I want the game now. That's the latest game, and I want it, how can I get it today? So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And that is very true, and you see it nowadays with digital distribution. I mean, the idea that I can have it immediately really makes a lot of sense, especially just look at the announcements. The new PlayStation, new Xbox are both going to have diskless options.
Yeah. Well, it's a way of bringing the price down, which is, one thing.
True.
And then, of course, and why do they need this? They'll just download it. Yeah.
It's going to be hell for the people who want to collect and preserve the software. I mean, how are you going to get a copy of a download-only game 20 years from now?
That's true.
But the pirates will make sure that the stuff is there.
I mean, there'll be some simulation of a Grimm Brothers tunnel through a mountain someplace, in iron, carved out of iron ore, where this stuff will be kept.
One might think. Although there's a lot of stuff, for example, from the original Xbox Live from 15 years ago, games that there are no available copies. They've simply disappeared. Yeah, because they were games that either required some online component, which if you no longer have the server isn't there, or because the system still hasn't been properly emulated. There wasn't a market for, passing it on. The systems that were easily emulated, the software is everywhere. There's going to be certain games that are simply going to be lost to time, unfortunately. I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.